use my microphone so people online can hear me. So we'll bring this to order. So I will let everybody introduce themselves, and then we can do opening remarks. I'll start.
Hi, I'm Christine Howard from the 167th District, which is in Chester County.
Good morning. My name is Dan Williams. I represent the 74th District, also in Chester County.
Good morning, everybody. Ben Sanchez, and I'm from Montgomery County.
Jim Rigby, 71st, which is Cambria and Somerset counties.
Thank you all for being here today. We had a great subcommittee hearing last week and continue it this week in talking about ways in which we can make our communities safer and sort of different ideas in kind of our approach to criminal justice. So I'm excited to have all of our testifiers here to talk about crime deterrence and community safety. Do you have any opening remarks, Chair?
No, I'd be anxious to hear what's going to be presented today and look forward to working with these folks moving forward. Thank you.
So I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Emily Kincaid. I represent the 20th District in Allegheny County. So our first panel is Leah Sakala from the Alliance for Justice. She's the State Policy Director, and Professor David Harris from the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. Professor Harris, we'll start with you. We'll do your opening remarks, and then we'll open it up for questions after both of you have done your opening remarks.
Good morning, everyone. Representative Kincaid, Chair Rigby, it's a great pleasure to be invited here to speak to you today. Pitt Law, my institution, prioritizes teaching and research that is directly impactful on the greater public interest. And so I can't think of any place I would rather be today serving that mission. The very important issue that you have before you from the 30,000-foot view is how do we increase public safety? How do we have a commonwealth in which everyone gets to share in the benefits of being safe, having a safe place to live, to work, so that we can all thrive and do everything that we want to do in our communities. In that context, the question of criminal deterrence has an important role to play, because if you can deter crime, if you can keep it from happening, we're going to have greater public safety, and that will benefit each and every one of us who live in this state. So we want to increase deterrence. And the question this morning here is, how do we increase deterrence? Deterrence is one of the four major purposes of punishment in the criminal justice system, the four major purposes of criminal law. And if we know how to do that, we'll all be better off. And fortunately, we do know. We have some solid information from years of research and study on this question. We actually know what works and what doesn't work in order to increase deterrence. The bottom line is we know that increasing the length of sentences, increasing the severity of punishment, putting people in prison for longer periods of time does not bring us increased deterrence. The only studies that really say anything even remotely about an increase in deterrence from those sources say there might be a very, very modest effect that you would get. But that's not the way to greater deterrence. We know what does work, and what does work is increasing the risk that the potential criminal will get caught. Right? It is not often that I can say we actually know, that we actually have an answer. One of the great little secrets of criminology and criminal law is there are a lot of things we don't know, but this we do. We know what works and we know what doesn't work. So let me dig in and give you a little deeper explanation just by way of an opener. What doesn't work? We know that to increase the length of sentences, make punishments more severe, put people in prison for longer and longer periods, whether that's through just increasing the length of sentence on a particular crime or creating new crimes or enhanced sentences for this, that, or the other factor or mandatory minimums, those things do not result in greater deterrence. Here are the reasons why. Number one, potential criminals don't know what the sentences are. They have no idea. They never think of it. It is not within their thought process. Lots of crimes are committed as what we would call crimes of opportunity. There's the opportunity, they decide to take it. It's that simple. Other crimes are committed because a person is unfortunately in the throes of addiction. And a person who's addicted needs money. They need money to buy their drug of addiction, and to get that fast money, they commit crimes. And it is not within any of their mental processes that they would think, gee, what's the sentence? They have no knowledge of that. They don't care. It's all about something else. So without any knowledge of what the sentence is, the sentence itself has no deterrent power. With that kind of a mental framework, you can see why increasing sentences would not be an effective way to get more deterrence. Another thing to note about increasing the use of prisons and why that does not deter is to understand that it may actually have the opposite effect of deterring. It may actually result in more crime and recidivism. For 6 years, between 2016 and 2022, I ran a podcast. This was before every 6-year-old that you could think of had a podcast, so I got out of that business. But this was a kind of side project for me, a real labor of love. I got to speak to lots and lots of the most important and impactful people on the criminal justice side of things. And these were chiefs of police and prosecutors and defense lawyers. One of my guests for one of these sessions was John Little. I imagine some of you remember him. He was the Secretary of Corrections of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. He served in both Republican and Democratic administrations, widely respected across Pennsylvania and across the country, too. One of the things he said in the course of our conversations has always stuck with me. It's a very, very short sentence. He said this: prison is criminogenic. Criminogenic. Now, that may sound a little familiar. You ever hear the word carcinogenic, like causes cancer? Secretary Little said prison is criminogenic. And what he said in his explanation, and it rings true to me, and it rings true to the research too, is that when you put people in prison for longer and longer periods, they tend to have the impulse to become better at what they did that got them in. They have more opportunities to learn new criminal tactics, become better criminals. The longer you keep them in, the more that is true. And when we keep them in, we also don't generate a deterrent effect. Again, we may have the opposite effect. The other thing to remember, the Secretary reminded me, was that there is a very distinct pattern in terms of the age of people who commit crime and when they generally tail off in committing crime. What I mean by that is lots of the criminal activity, it is concentrated in a very small number of people in any town or city, a very small percentage of people, and those people tend to be younger. 18, 20, 25. By the time people hit around the age of 35, they age out. That is the term used in the literature. They tend to age out. Doesn't mean that people over 35 never commit crimes. Far from it. But if you looked at the age distribution, you would find that after age 35, it's just not as common anymore. It really tails off. So when we keep people in prison beyond age 35, we are actually spending our precious taxpayer dollars on something that is, for the most part, not needed. If we got people out of prison, gave them the kind of background and tools they need to succeed, gave them an education, which is, by the way, the most important preventer of recidivism, we would be a lot better off than just keeping them in prison and keeping them in prison. And that's us who would be better off, in addition to the individual. Prison does incapacitate, of course. It keeps them from victimizing people like us on the outside. But don't forget, lots of people work in the prison system. There are correctional officers, there are counselors, there are doctors and nurses and repair people. Those people are inside too. And since people aren't deterred by longer sentences, they, and of course the incarcerated population inside, they are all put at greater risk. So those are some of the chief reasons that we see in the data, in the research, that increasing length and severity of sentence does not deter. So that's what doesn't work. What does work? Again, we're very fortunate. The literature is really, really clear. What does work is increasing the risk of getting caught. If you can up the risk that the potential criminal will be apprehended, will be caught, it doesn't matter how long the sentence is, that's what they care about. They really care about whether they're going to get caught and get away with it, because if you increase that risk, you get a definite, measurable deterrent effect. This has been shown over and over, and especially in a great study in Philadelphia. What kind of action will deter and increase the risk of getting caught? It is to have a police presence. Now, the police presence, the use of police must be very precise. Random patrol does not do this. It does not deter. It has no deterrent effect. What does? I'll give you two examples very quickly. Hotspots policing. We can look at data in almost real time now in almost any city, and we can know crime occurs 50% or more of the time in a handful of places in any town or city, in front of these addresses or in these homes or in front of this liquor store or on this corner. If we put our law enforcement forces in those places, in the hot spots, it has a measurable deterrent effect. Crime drops, crimes of violence drop. This was shown, like I said, in a groundbreaking study in Philadelphia that came out in 2016. I'd be glad to refer you to it. The other thing we can do is increase the use of community-based policing efforts. What I mean by that, just for purposes of this hearing, I'll define it the way I define it, which is when police and community are partners, when they define the goals of law enforcement together, when they measure things together, and they hold each other accountable. And when policing is done in a way that respects everybody that lives in the neighborhood, treats everybody like the citizens they are, and understands that it's a very few people in any given neighborhood, even a so-called high crime area, only a very small percentage of people are actually up to no good. It's 2, 3, 5% at most. The rest of the folks are just trying to live. And we can't treat them all as either victims or criminals. When you do that, when you create that partnership, you won't need a police officer on every corner. The people and the police will work together. So those two things really do have a deterrent effect. Hotspots policing and community policing. That's what works. That's what doesn't, to bring us greater deterrence. I think what you're here to discuss today could not be more important, and I am very, very grateful for the opportunity to talk to you about it. Thank you. I would be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you, Professor Harris. Before we turn it over, we've been joined by a couple members of the Judiciary Committee, including Chairman Briggs, who's the chair of the committee as a whole. If anybody wants to introduce themselves.
Thank you for having us, and thank you for having this discussion. Tim Briggs from Montgomery County.
Representative Rabb from Philadelphia County. Good to see you, Professor.
Thank you. You can go ahead.
Good morning, Chair Kincaid, Minority Chair Rigby, and members of the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Crime and Corrections. My name is Leah Sakala, and I'm testifying on behalf of the Alliance for Safety and Justice, a multi-state public safety organization that focuses on key states, including Pennsylvania. We organize a nationwide network of underserved crime survivors that includes over 200,000 members nationwide and about 8,000 here in Pennsylvania. And my background is in public safety policy research, looking at both changes within our safety institutions as well as community-based safety strategies. I'm really grateful to be part of this hearing this morning because safety is one of the absolute most important public policy goals. And I think it's important to start our conversation by recognizing that violence creates intergenerational cycles of trauma with devastating impacts, so there's a lot at stake. Immediate consequences for victims, of course, include injury and death, trauma, and mental health disorders, including PTSD and substance abuse. Violence also causes things like housing instability, job loss, and puts victims at higher risk of being re-victimized in the future. Violence also has community-level impacts, making it harder for kids to learn in school, contributing to food instability, and creating challenges for local businesses that are trying to succeed. Violence is highly concentrated in communities with historical disinvestment and underinvestment, and disproportionately impacts people who are Black, brown, and low income. And this pain and suffering comes at a huge community and fiscal cost. And as people who care about policymaking that improves people's lives, we can't think about any things like community development, public health, workforce and economic development, educational outcomes, or equity without addressing public safety. Now, over and over again, when we're talking with our crime survivor members about their policy priorities, they emphasize that what they want most of all is for what happened to them to never happen again, to them or to anyone else. And that's why we have to get it right. In order to get it right, we have to be willing to learn from past mistakes and build on what the research shows is working. So just to echo some of the remarks that Professor Harris made, deterrence, of course, is in the title of today's hearing. And to give a little context, it's a theory that's been around for a long time, but had a particularly strong influence on policymaking in the United States, starting in the 60s and 70s, when criminology started looking to economics to understand why people do harmful things and what we can do about it. And the idea is that if you make a punishment severe enough, people will choose to avoid the behavior that leads to those punishments. But unfortunately, as the professor mentioned, we've learned since then that that's just not how brains, people, groups, or communities work. A large and growing body of research has found time and again that making punishment harsher isn't an effective way to deter crime. And as Professor Harris mentioned, certainty can work better, but our system is simply not delivering on that in large. More than half of violent crimes aren't reported, and of those that are, clearance rates are persistently low. So just taking a step back, at its root, violence comes from trauma, lack of opportunity, insufficient systems of care, and inadequate responses to crisis. Focusing on only punishment doesn't address any of those problems, and in fact can make them worse. And victims of violence who have paid the highest price for the failures in our safety systems know this all too well. They overwhelmingly support policy solutions that address the root causes of crime over ones that focus only on enforcement and punishment. And now for the good news. We know a lot about what works to stop cycles of crime too. And research shows that these things include violence prevention, opportunities to offer healing and support for crime victims, and rehabilitation that creates pathways away from the criminal justice system. And I'll briefly overview each of these three things, but also just want to mention that we actually just released a new report overviewing 9 key recommendations for public safety in Pennsylvania, which includes more detail on the things I'm about to talk about and was submitted along with my written testimony for your reference. So the first key area is prevention. And this is based in the fact that the most effective way to mitigate the harms of violence is to keep it from happening in the first place. Traditionally, we've relied primarily, or in some places exclusively, on police to do this work. But we know that the problem requires far broader investment to fill the gaps that remain in our public safety infrastructure. And there's really good research to back this up. An important point is actually the capacity of local organizations is directly associated with crime rates. One study found that 10 additional organizations focused on crime and community life, or preventing crime and making communities stronger, led to a 9% reduction in the murder rate, a 6% reduction in the violent crime rate, and a 4% reduction in the property crime rate. And these relationships are direct and they're causal. A critical type of local prevention organization that I want to specifically highlight is violence interruption. And this is a strategy in which trained professionals who are trusted in their own communities work to de-escalate conflict and prevent retaliation. And this can happen both in the street and also in hospital settings where they connect with survivors of violence and intervene before further violence happens. And evaluations have found this model to work. Particularly, there was just one that came out looking at violence intervention in Baltimore, done by Johns Hopkins, that found some really great, really promising results. The second major area here is support for survivors, and this is because we simply can't break cycles of violence without supporting people who have been victimized. People who have been victimized in the past are far more likely to be victimized again, and investing in them is investing in public safety. These protections take a few forms. And the first is investing in local organizations that survivors turn to when they are in crisis. Some are survivor-led grassroots organizations that offer peer-to-peer support, often around the clock and on a shoestring budget. And the second is model I want to highlight is expanding survivors' access to a type of organization called a trauma recovery center. And this is an evidence-based model that provides both clinical care and also wraparound case management support to survivors in the wake of violence, both stabilizing them in immediate crisis as well as putting them on a path to long-term healing. Right now, Pennsylvania has a single TRC, which is here in Harrisburg, but of course, survivors in other areas of the state don't have access yet. Another key support for survivors is putting legal protections in place to ensure that no victim loses housing or a job because of their victimization. Many other states have these kinds of protections, but Pennsylvania has yet to put them into place. And then also important to mention is many people in the criminal justice system have histories of victimization themselves, and sometimes this connection is directly related to the reason that they're in the criminal justice system. Protections for survivors who are arrested, charged, and punished can allow courts to consider this link when they're making case decisions. And the third major area of public safety I want to mention is rehabilitation. And this is because we have to offer people who are in the criminal justice systems meaningful pathways to get out of it and stay out of it in the future. This starts upstream at the local level with stronger diversion programs that give people who may be facing charges opportunities to take responsibility for their actions by addressing the underlying causes. This also includes access to programming and treatment for people who are incarcerated and on community supervision. Research shows that rehabilitative programs can significantly reduce recidivism. And by rehabilitative programming, I mean things like education, workforce training, job opportunities, therapy and treatment, and opportunities to volunteer and contribute to the community. Incentivizing people to engage in programming by coupling rehabilitative opportunities with pathways out of the criminal justice system, such as mechanisms like early parole consideration through earned credits, strengthens the public safety impact even more. And rehabilitation also requires helping people who come home from prison succeed during the reentry process. This might sound super obvious, but having basic needs met, like having a job, a stable place to live, and access to health care, all decrease the likelihood that someone will return to prison in the future. But for many people, having a criminal record can be a significant barrier to achieving these things. Pennsylvania has made good progress towards establishing pathways for people to change old records through its clean slate policies and can build on that momentum and expand them further. So in conclusion, I just want to note that these type of solutions have broad support, and it's because they work. We did a national survey of crime survivors in 2022 and found that by a margin of more than 2-to-1, victims prefer investment in crime prevention, crisis assistance, and strong communities over increasing arrests, punishment, and incarceration. Pennsylvania has a great groundwork to build on for many of these strategies, but so much more progress is needed, and we are committed to working with you all to move the ball forward. So I thank you again so much for inviting me to be here today. I would be really happy to answer any questions you might have, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Representative Williams?
Good morning, and thank you. I really appreciated the testimony of you both. Dr. Harris, initially, I think I'm hearing you describe what is empirical data that suggests our present practice is actually producing what we're trying to eliminate and avoid. That right now, our forms of corrections are exacerbating the problem to the degree where we're creating over and over again our problem simply because of the way we are practicing corrections. Is that accurate?
Yes, sir. The thought process for years, not just in Pennsylvania, but in many of our states, has been that if we want to stop crime, want to deter crime, we make the punishment more severe, and that will appeal to a person's reasoning, and they will not do it. And the data is very clear that reasoning plays very little role. Knowledge of sentences is not there. That's not part of the criminal calculus. So that when we use prison as our main or maybe only response to crime and wanting greater public safety, we are not stopping it. That's number one. And everyone that you stop, every crime that doesn't happen is an arrest that doesn't have to happen. It's jail time that doesn't have to be served. It's a victim who is not victimized. It's a community that is not impacted. So I understand, everybody should, the desirability of stopping a crime before it happens, but this doesn't do it. And when you keep people in on longer and longer sentences, there's every reason to anticipate that they're not getting better. They are perhaps in a better position to reoffend. And our recidivism rates in the Commonwealth are I mean, it's not like they're a lot worse than most other states. Nationally, it's 2/3 of the people going back to prison after 3 years, and some substantial portion even before 3 years. So what we're doing clearly isn't working if what we want is stopping that cycle. I think it was very interesting that we are paired up together today, because we have a sort of both-and way of looking at this. You need those police techniques that can increase the risk of getting caught. The severity of the sentence does not help. And you support crime victims. One of the most important pieces of legal literature, I'll call it that for lack of a better term, that I get to teach my students is a survey done by the Alliance. And it was just referred to, that shows that victims are only being offered, well, we can put the person away for longer and longer. That's not what they want. 2 to 1, they want something that helps them.
Now, I appreciate that response. I want to make sure that I pronounce your last name correctly.
It's Sakala. Thanks for
Dr.
asking.
Sakala. Just I guess a more philosophical question I'd like you to respond to. In talking about prevention, you identified what I think are foundations. I'm thinking that poverty is its own kind of violence that sort of keeps perpetuating criminal behavior. That this environment of poverty alone is one of the stimulants that keeps moving us in the wrong direction. How do you respond to that?
Thanks for that question. Both violence and poverty are highly concentrated on the same communities. There's been some really powerful research done showing that lack of resources, lack of opportunities, trauma and violence all go hand in hand, and it's really important to recognize that these are policy decisions that we are all making about where to invest our resources and how to make sure that every community in every state, Pennsylvania and elsewhere, has opportunities to find safe places to live, has access to food, has access to quality health care, has meaningful employment opportunities, and can live in dignity and thrive. And so I appreciate that connection, because it's structural and it's profound.
I appreciate that. Madam Chair, no more questions.
Thank you, Rep. Williams. Rep. Rabb?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you both for your testimonies. I represented a neighborhood for my first 3 terms in office as arguably one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the entire Commonwealth, Chestnut Hill in Northwest Philadelphia. And one of the comments I make to my constituents and beyond is that it's one of the safest neighborhoods in the Commonwealth, and there is virtually no police presence. And so I push back on the assumption that what makes us safe is more policing. What makes us more safe is more resources. And so that ties to my esteemed colleague, Representative Williams, who's talking about the connection between poverty and crime. And so if you have all the resources, that sure as hell is going to help. With that said, in the areas in my district and beyond in Philadelphia where there are indeed hot spots, there's a project called the 57 Block Project that initially identified the 57 most dangerous blocks in the city of Philadelphia. It's expanded to 77 blocks. So they have identified indeed those hot spots in the city of the first class. What is the nature of the policing activity that has to happen for a efficacious hotspot, prevention strategy? So is it they're just sitting in their, squad cars on the corner? What happens in these hotspots, and to what extent does community need to be involved in what happens at those hotspots? So it's really connecting the 2 points you mentioned, Professor.
Thank you, Representative. Yeah, that's the crucial thing. What happens? We can't just say, well, let's just put more cars out there, more people will drive by. That won't work. The Philadelphia experiment from the mid-20-teens had officers actually walking beats, had officers talking to people, and it focused itself on particular people, on people with records of bad actions and violent actions in those communities and in those hot spots. So the police were not there to treat everybody like a potential offender, to take every kid where grandma sends them down to the store for a quart of milk and throw them up against a wall and pat them down. That wasn't how it was done. It has to be well-informed, data and research-based, and particular to the offenders and the place. And you don't have to do anything except engage people. Just walk up and talk to them. But you can't just sit in your car, because if you do that, there's no real effect. So it takes treating the community as a worthy place. The same as Chestnut Hill. You wouldn't do that in Chestnut Hill. You don't need to do it there because they have the resources, as you said. But if you're going to do hotspots policing, involve the community, get them to be part of the team, and have your policing effort very precise, targeted at the right people in the right places. That is what produced the effect. And don't make the mistake that we have made so often in the past, which is just to treat the whole community as a bunch of either offenders or victims, because that's not the way it is.
If I may, quick follow-up, thank you. So one of my greatest fears as a father of two black sons who are 17 and 20, and frankly myself, is the trauma of being stopped and frisked. And the whole culture of identifying folks who inhabit black bodies as the problem. And this is an ongoing concern, particularly in Philadelphia, with different elected officials standing up for stop and frisk and those of us who are vehemently opposed. What is the connection? What is the correlation between a stop and frisk policy in hotspots and also violence interrupters being a part of a policing strategy in hotspots?
I'll leave to my colleague to the question of violence interrupters. But I think when people think of stop and frisk, what often comes to mind is New York, because they had a big federal trial there in which a judge said this is basically profiling. In point of fact, The stop and frisk activity was more intense in Philadelphia than in New York by population. If left to each individual officer to simply decide on the spot who will be stopped, who will be frisked, who will be questioned, you do get effects like profiling. It is unavoidable. What the Philadelphia experiment in the mid-teens did was at roll calls, in whatever opportunities they were, they identified particular individuals who were at risk of committing violent crime. They did not say, you know, stop whoever you think is suspicious, because that leads inevitably to a blanket suspicion of people of color. We've seen that over and over and over in every city. So they targeted the effort very, very precisely. And by having the officers in those neighborhoods, in those hotspots consistently to walk beats, they got to know the folks. They got to know the people who lived there. They got to see who was doing what, and they could recognize 2 blocks away at a glance, there's the guy I got to keep my eye on, not just people walking down the street living in the neighborhood. So it takes that kind of effort and precision if you're really going to make this sort of thing work.
Thanks for the question about the violence interrupters. This model works because it is also highly geographically specific, but in a very different way. And that's because violence interrupters are professionals who are people who are from the neighborhoods, not just communities, but specific neighborhoods that they work in. They have relationships and trust with the people that they are interacting with because they have grown up with them, they know them, they are trusted and embedded in those communities. And that's what makes them effective at understanding why conflicts arise, intervening to de-escalate when things seem like they're getting heated or potentially out of control. So it is also a very geographically targeted strategy, but it's based on relationships and trust and prevention.
Any other questions, Chairman?
Thank you. Thank you both for your testimonies today. I come from a background of law enforcement, 40 years. Went in 83, part-time most of my life, resigned as a chief when I got elected. Community policing, I know it works. In our city, we have a young officer who would find bicycles and fix them up, and then would hand them out to the kids in the neighborhood. Got to know who the children were in our projects. And in certain areas, again, we're looking at pockets where traditionally there was crime and problems. And it's amazing, those kids are the ones that come up to the officer and say, hey, this is going to happen after school today down here on the corner, to where you have that bond and that trust. I think the problem we see, and it's changed in my 40 years, is the respect that is no longer there. Now, you had mentioned that the crime in the communities, it's not everyone, it's a few. And I would like to think that's the same with law enforcement. Not all policemen are bad, but we do have our bad ones. So part of this, I think we need to change the image of what law enforcement is. Getting those policemen into those communities, back to the foot patrols. Problem we're seeing now, our academy just graduated 11 students. When I graduated, we were doing 30 every 3 months, 120 in the course of a year. We don't have the manpower. Our city's down over 20 officers right now, so you're running a skeleton crew to where you can only make that pass through the neighborhood. You can't stop and shoot basketballs or do whatever with those. So how do we change the image of the police in those communities? How do we get more policemen into this line of work? Look, not many want to do it. There was a day when it was respected, and I can tell you when I left, that went out the window. So just your thoughts.
Thank you for the question. It will take time, certainly, because we all know trust can be lost in a heartbeat, but it takes effort and incident and time and time and time to build it, or in some cases, rebuild it. And for too long, I think we thought of law enforcement as just that, enforcing the law. We did not think of it as providing safety for everyone in the community. In too many places, and I certainly can't speak to where you were working, sir, but in too many places in the Commonwealth and otherwise, the assumption going into a neighborhood experiencing higher than average levels of crime was that everybody was up to something. I mean, I've done my ride-alongs, I've seen it, and it's just not true. It's not true. And that mindset has an effect on the people who are policed. We have to actually go back to first principles. The first police departments sprang up in Great Britain back in the 19th century, and one of the most important principles put forth by Robert Peel, Sir Robert Peel, who originated that police department in London, was the people are the police and the police are the people. And there has to be that kind of connection. And in too many places, it's completely broken down. So, you know, we didn't get into this overnight. We won't get out of it overnight. To rebuild that mutual respect, it has to be mutual respect. And in too many places, it has not been true for too long. So that will be difficult, but it's worth doing because, in point of fact, police cannot do the job of creating public safety alone. One of the more interesting things that I think you've seen here today is how our approaches would actually be complementary. I believe in everything that my colleague has said. I also believe the police have an important role to play. And we need to find ways to make those things work together. When we have relied on technological fixes to get ourselves spread more thin, the results are always, almost always disappointing. So I would just say we've got to come back to what we used to do. We've got to come back to connecting and being part of the community. That's what will regenerate that mutual trust.
Yeah, and I agree. We definitely need more feet, more boots on the ground. Putting the eye in the sky and a camera on every corner isn't correcting the problem at all.
No, sir.
And if I may add quickly, appreciate the question, and just to provide another element that I think is really important. You know, I mentioned in my remarks that many, like half of violent crimes go unreported, and so people aren't going to the police. And when we talk with our survivor members, the vast majority of them don't get any kind of help or support to stabilize in those moments of crisis. Whatsoever. They might, you know, rely heavily on family and friends, but when it comes to things like, you know, help with moving to a safe place or burying a loved one, you know, they're largely on their own. And so if we can put more infrastructure in place for survivors who experience violence to stabilize in those moments of crisis, that will give them better agency to then choose, you know, to come forward and how they want to proceed based on what happened with them.
Thank you. So just as our final question, I think kind of bringing together Chair Rigby and Rep. Rabb's kind of line of questioning, Rep. Rabb mentioned Chestnut Hill, and I think one of the reasons that, you know, in addition to resources, but one of the reasons that that neighborhood doesn't have a lot of police is also because there is that kind of community trust in police, that if you call the police, they will respond, and they will respond in a way that will help and not harm the community. And, you know, we had last week a hearing on restorative justice, and so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about sort of the role that not just police but also prosecutors could have in this, you know, kind of community building, trust building, you know, way of addressing crime and community safety.
Thank you for that question, Chair. When we talk with our members, one of the most important things that we hear is that they want to be able to have agency to decide what kind of answers they need, what kind of safety they need, and what kind of protections that they need. And so you mentioned there are certain strategies that the criminal justice system as a whole, including all of the actors from police to DAs, can play to really make space to listen to survivors' voices, understand what they need, and be responsive to that. And sometimes, it's alternate channels to get answers and work towards healing and reconciliation outside the criminal justice system. And sometimes it's proceeding, through more formal channels, but making sure that as we design these systems and as we choose who the individuals are who are on these front lines and making these critical decisions that impact not only public safety as a whole, but can have a profound impact on the experience of a survivor and of people who do harm, that we're really choosing people who are conscious of respecting that agency and making space for it.
I couldn't agree more. What a prosecutor can do is to look at each and every case as representing an individual, to look at all of the people involved as worthy and as deserving of attention. And again, that very impactful study by the Alliance in which people who had been victims of crime said, we need help as victims. We don't just want to be offered, well, I'll go for the highest sentence when we come to trial or we have a plea. Those things are, not enough. It's just very clear that that's not enough. And so I would tell prosecutors to listen to what victims want. Bring that message back here to you all to get that lined up so the system as a whole can respond to victims in a way that will help them, restore them, get them on their feet, as well as mete out punishment. We need both of those things, and we have only one of them now for the most part. The other thing that prosecutors can do is to look at each of the cases and ask themselves, does this really deserve to be prosecuted? Because if I go back to the example that Representative Rabb used of Chestnut Hill, I guarantee you every shoplifting case and every possession of marijuana case coming out of Chestnut Hill is not being prosecuted. Some might be, most are not. Their parents are being called, things like that. We want a system that is sensible and proportional.
Thank you. Thank you both for your testimony. We will now move to our second panel. You guys are getting settled. Our second panel is comprised of Mike O'Donnell, the District Attorney for Northumberland County, Catherine Janicki, Director of Clinical Services from the Pittsburgh Action Against Rape, and Dr. Brett Buckland from the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. Because Kate is online, I will open with her, and then we'll go to our in-person testifiers. Again, we'll have all of you deliver your opening statements and then open it up for questions. Kate, can you hear us? There we go.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Hello, everyone. I'm Kate Janicki. I'm the director at Pittsburgh Action Against Rape for the clinical department. Thank you for allowing me to speak today. Pittsburgh Action Against Rape is a nonprofit rape crisis center located in Pittsburgh's South Side neighborhood. PAR's longtime mission to end sexual violence has included the interventions of advocacy, mental health treatment, and support, and outreach in Allegheny County for over 50 years. According to the CDC, about 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 13 boys in the United States experience childhood sexual abuse. These survivors experience several trauma-related symptoms, including nightmares, panic attacks, anger and irritability, fear, negative thoughts about themselves and others. They never feel safe, and they often feel a loss of control in their body or of their emotions. These intrusive trauma-related symptoms impede the child survivor's ability to succeed academically, successfully participate in activities of daily living, and form safe, healthy attachments with significant others. On average, PAR provides services to about 80 unique child survivors per month. And right now, we have about 30 children on our trauma processing wait list. I'm sure you know a little bit about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Scale, which is a tool that measures childhood trauma and adversity. It has 10 questions on the survey, like did a parent or an adult insult you, push you, sexually abuse you, and so on. The higher the score, the higher risk of health, social, and emotional problems, including the likelihood of engaging in violence. Individuals with a cumulatively higher ACEs score are linked to an increase in violent behavior. Researchers have found that additional ACE scores associated were about 35 to 144% increase in the risk of interpersonal and self-directed violence. Because PAR provides services for community members impacted by sexual violence, that's the framework in which I will explain what Allegheny County is in need of. In the last 3 years, PAR has seen an increase in referrals for children that have experienced sexual abuse and engage in problematic sexual behaviors. Prior to 2020, this would have resulted in a referral to an outside treatment provider, most likely a residential treatment facility who specializes in problematic sexual behavior because, quote, PAR did not treat the perpetrators. However, upon further inspection, this simply is not accurate information. All of the referrals that PAR receives that include children that engage in problematic sexual behavior also include an extensive history of sexual abuse and most often many other traumatic events. Many times, PAR is not even aware of the problematic sexual behavior until it becomes evident after months of trauma treatment at PAR. Research shows that children who engage in problematic sexual behavior, and from now on I'll say PSB, often have a history of sexual abuse and more often are linked to physical abuse, witnessing domestic violence, caregiver instability, and other forms of childhood abuse and neglect. As Bessel van der Kolk said in The Body Keeps the Score, trauma breeds further trauma. Hurt people hurt other people. As of today, PAR is aware of only 2 referral sources for children who engage in PSB that are not for adjudicated children or children involved with CYF. There is a treatment for children involved with CYF at UPMC's Partners for Family Empowerment program. However, you must be referred by CYF. There is also a treatment for adjudicated youth who engage in PSB at UPMC's Services for Adolescents and Family Enrichment program. However, the child needs to be court mandated into the program. So what happens to the children who are not involved with CYF or the court? And these programs through UPMC, they only address the child's own problematic sexual behavior, not the trauma that they have experienced. Another point is that the children who are not forced into treatment by CYF or the court and have a history of trauma and engage in PSB have nowhere to turn. Their caregivers feel ashamed, they're afraid, they don't know who will accept a child that engages in PSB. Usually a referral to any community member is no, because they don't feel that they have the specialized training to treat PSB. What if we identified children at risk to engage in PSB based on history of trauma and provided programs to teach resiliency? It has become imperative at PAR that we add another intervention to end sexual violence, resiliency programming. Resilience is the ability of a child to recover and show early and effective adaptation following a potential traumatic event. Resiliency within a child is enhanced if the child has the support of their family or significant others and community systems. They have access to needed resources and coping skills and strong and healthy relationships. This is basically exactly what Drs. Harris and Sakala were talking about earlier. Officers playing basketball and making connections is proof that resiliency and attachment works. Resilience can be learned, it can be taught. Resilience can mitigate the impact of ACEs, therefore impacting rates of violence in the community. The heart of resiliency is cultivating healthy social, emotional development in children and families. Resiliency learning can start before a trauma or problematic behavior even occurs. If treatment providers are given the resources to attempt to prevent traumas from occurring and prevent the impact of trauma when it does occur, it makes logical sense that incidents of violence would decrease overall, including problematic sexual behavior. Instead of waiting until the child is involved with CYF or adjudicated, providers across PA could be teaching resilience to families. We could be providing resiliency program to children at risk. But this can only be done if agencies are given specific funding for resiliency programs, as right now there's an overwhelming need to provide services to those who have already been traumatized. And in closing, the last question on the ACEs score is, did a household member go to prison? Remember, even a score of 1 on the ACEs doubles your chances of becoming an alcoholic. Thank you very much.
Thank you. DA O'Donnell?
Thank you very much, Rep. Kincaid. Ladies and gentlemen of the Judicial Subcommittee, thank you very much for having me today. It's a real honor to be here. My name's Mike O'Donnell. I'm the District Attorney in Northumberland County, which is the county directly above Dauphin County. Prior to my election, I was the Conflicts Counsel in Northumberland, Snyder, and Union counties. Conflicts Counsel is essentially a public defender. When there's 2 co-defendants, the public defender typically takes the easier client, and the Conflicts Counsel typically takes the more difficult one. While I was in law school, I actually worked at a hospital here in Camp Hill, Holy Spirit Hospital. That hospital has a mental health ward to it. Actually, I saw today Lam Trong just came in the room. We actually worked evening shift together at Holy Spirit Hospital, and I'm sure he can fill you in on some of the stories that we dealt with at that time. So my time as a public defender, my time working in a hospital, the mental health wing, that's truly shaped my policies and perspectives on crime deterrence for adults, and specifically today I'm going to talk about mental health and addiction. So as a public defender, as I always would say, the job security in our criminal justice system is the best job security of any profession. Typically, I couldn't get my client out of jail fast enough before he would be back. And why is that? Is that because these individuals did not want help, the help's available and they didn't want to use it, or the resources are not available? For mental health specifically, mental health issues and individuals with mental health diagnosis make up a large percentage of the phone calls that our law enforcement deal with on a day-to-day. In Milton Borough in Northumberland County, we actually have a mental health expert that responds to calls. Our Chief Zettlemore has estimated that 10% of the total calls that he deals with are mental health related. Having a mental health expert on the force allows our police force to be able to have a constant connection with these individuals. They have a relationship. They not only have a relationship with these individuals that we deal with multiple phone calls and multiple incidences, but they also have a relationship with the resources that are available and the individuals in the industry. This frontline resource has been a tremendous success in our borough, has really helped limit the time that our officers are spending at these mental health calls, and has really made a big difference in the ultimate recidivism rate that we deal with for these phone calls, or for these individual issues. Because the issue we have to deal with is that if you are going to incarcerate someone with mental health needs, our prison and Northumberland County Jail is just not equipped to handle that. We're understaffed, our staff is overworked and underpaid, and they simply don't have the ability to essentially do the one-on-one care that's necessary. So if we are just simply sending these individuals to jail, we're just simply kicking the can to someone else to have to deal with. We're able to deal with this proactively, have someone on the front lines, a frontline resource that can establish this relationship. We're often able to de-escalate the situation, provide, our officers the ability to leave the scene and have our mental health expert continue trying to calm this individual down, de-escalate the situation. And this ultimately leads to a better result for the individual, leads to a better result for our community, and ultimately is not just putting all the burden on our jail, who does not have the ability to handle this. When these individuals with these severe mental health issues are incarcerated, they can become victims in the jail, and that often the lack of supervision has led to tragic results, both with suicides and attempted suicides and other incidents such as that. So by having resources for mental health and by having this on the front lines, this has really made a tremendous impact. It's something that's not available for all our law enforcement. I would like to see a mental health expert be in all our departments. I know Pennsylvania State Police, is a large percentage of our county as well. They don't have this, so they don't have a mental health expert that responds to calls. And this is something, this is a frontline resource that really allows us to get a better result. And again, not just kick the can to leave the problem to someone else. And this is just a constant factor that we will always have to deal with. Mental health is just a component of everyday life. Some individuals have needs that are going to be having to be taken care of every day. Sometimes there's just a mental health episode. And if we have the resources there and the ability to provide these resources to our frontline guys, we're able to essentially stop this problem before it gets out of hand or before we have to put it on, on our jail staff. Regarding addiction, one of the analogies I like to make is I always tell my client it's like building a home. We need to have a strong foundation in the home because there's always going to be a storm that we encounter. As the famous philosopher Curtis Jackson once said, death got to be easy because life is hard. Life is difficult. You're going to need that strong foundation. And luckily for me, I came from a great family, a great support, 2 parents. That's something that's really been a tremendous factor in my life. While I was working in the hospital and being a public defender, you really see the reality is a lot of these people, they certainly don't have 2 parents. They might not even have 1 parent, and they don't have any support. And so when we do this process of catch and release, we pick them up for a possession charge or a small minor crime, we incarcerate them, and then they're there for a couple months till we finally, they get sentenced, get a county sentence or probation, and then we just send them out to the same environment that they've been in. And that's not benefiting them. That's not reducing the recidivism rate that we deal with. And if they're not having this strong foundation, if they don't have those supports to go to, you're just throwing them back to their idiot friends. And those guys are not the support that's going to lead them to live a successful life. Programs such as work release, community service, these are programs that help these individuals maintain finances, work while they're incarcerated, so they have something to do besides just sit on their iPad and watch movies all day. They're actually getting services, so when they leave our jail, they have something that they can walk into. They're not walking into the no support environment that they have. And, a lot of times we don't realize what the environment that these guys are going back into, that there is, if they do have parents, they may have substance abuse addictions. They may be enabling this, these substance abuse addictions for their children or for their aunts and uncles. And we need to provide these resources while we have them, while we have them either on probation or while they're incarcerated. So when they are ultimately released or they're on supervision, they have that support. And when they make a mistake, like individuals will often do, everyone makes mistakes, their foundation is strong and they can weather the storm instead of just saying, well, good luck, there's no way to help you, you got to do it on your own. Can some individuals do it on their own? Yeah, there are a few select individuals there. But if you take away the supports from your average person, you take away all their support system, all the help they have, and you just leave them at ground zero, it's incredibly difficult to build your way up. It's just, it often can be a hopeless situation. And if these guys have no hope, they have this is a life that they know they're going to go back to, that this is the only choice they have, this is what happens. They go back and get into the same routine, same individuals, and you're dealing with these same guys over and over again, and that costs money to the system, and that doesn't lead to a better result for our community. So we need resources. Like I said, in my county, for specific, we don't have a work release program. And so we are constantly throwing these guys back out there and then being, well, we can't, why don't they get a job? It's like, well, if you haven't had employment history, you don't have these connections, you don't, most of your friends are unemployed and, living on assisted housing, you're not going to get that job. And if you don't get that job, then you're going to be, it's going to disincentivize you. It's more of a difficult process. And if you have these resources out there, not everyone's going to take advantage of the resources. I mean, there's always going to be individuals that if you gave them A, B, and C, they would never get to D. But there are the vast majority of people, if you provide these resources, you provide them a way to, that hand up to get out of there, that, you have them have a job, have them working in their community, which creates that pride in their community, they're able to start to pull themselves out of that. And I've worked in the other counties I worked in, we've had individuals who've done, been assigned community service. Next thing you know, that job or that employer needs to hire someone. So they go and, you've got them in the door. Now they're familiar with that business, familiar with that employer. And when a job opportunity opens up, they get hired. And without that that they wouldn't have, because they don't have that support system, they don't have that help, they can't do it on their own, and they're right back where we started. Again, that's costing our taxpayers money. That's not leading to a better result for our community. And ultimately, we want to get these guys out of here because these guys are our future. As the professor stated, 18 to 25, we're gonna have a lot of individuals who just, their brain is just not developed yet. I had a client, when I was a defense attorney, when he was 18 years old, he robbed 4 banks. They gave him a 60-year-long parole sentence. He did 10 years in state prison. He only had 1 write-up, was the first year he's in. So I don't know how familiar you guys are with state prisons, but to have 1 write-up in 10 years is amazing. So now he was able to get out. He was able to pull himself up, but he still had 40 years left of supervision. And that 40 years left of supervision allowed him to, prevented him from taking his son and being, taking him on field trips, because he had this criminal record, he was still on parole. And ultimately, we were able to get a pardon for him to get him off that, as a recommendation from his state parole officer. And when he got it, when he was incarcerated, one of the things he did was he started working in a community service program. He wound up getting a job through the state prison system, and now that's the job he still has. He's an outstanding member of our community, but it took that assistance to get there. And once the door is open, he went through it, and he didn't need the 40 years long of extra supervision he had. I mean, at the time he committed the crime, he was 18 years old. And by the time he would have been off supervision, he would have been almost 65, 70. So certainly, as far as addiction goes, a lot of these guys just don't have those supports, don't have the foundation that they need to weather the storm. So if we can provide that foundation, we can provide that support, it's not going to help everyone and save every single person, but the vast majority of individuals out there, this is what they need. And if we can provide this support ahead of time and have them so when they are released, that they have this foundation to go to, that's going to lead to a better result. That's going to save our taxpayers money, and that's going to make our communities better. So thank you guys again for having me today. It's been a real honor to be here, and thank you for the time.
Thank you. Dr. Buckland?
Good morning, Chair Kincaid and distinguished members of the subcommittee. It's an honor to testify before you this morning about this very important topic of what deters crime and community safety. By way of background, I'm the Director of Planning, Research, and Statistics for the Department of Corrections. I've been here for about 23 years with the department. My primary role with the department is to provide statistical support for the department, to evaluate our programs, our policies and practices, and to provide scientific evidence for what we do to determine is what we're doing effective or not effective in terms of deterring crime and recidivism? I lead a small team of about 10 researchers. We partner with many academic partners in Pennsylvania and around the country. We've done a lot of program evaluations, and most recently, we authored the 2022 recidivism report, which I'll speak a little bit about. Today's topic is a broad topic on what deters crime. This covers a lot of area, as you heard from the previous testifiers. I'm going to focus on what deters crime in the area of corrections, since that's my area of purview. And so I'm going to focus on that, not necessarily policing or the courts or other areas that have been amply covered this morning. Some of my points will actually coincide with what Professor Harris testified, which I thought was an excellent testimony, and I would agree with everything that he testified to this morning. So I'm going to repeat some of the things that Professor Harris talked about and just put a finer tune point on it in terms of corrections. When it comes to the prison system or corrections, there are 4 main purposes of a correctional system. One would be incapacitation. The second would be retribution. The third would be rehabilitation. And the fourth would be deterrence. I'm going to focus on the last 2 of those, rehabilitation and deterrence. And in practice, both of those are essentially the same. The goal of those is to prevent future crimes by altering an individual's behavior. You can think about rehabilitation as a positive form of deterrence. So we're providing treatment, counseling, programming. We're trying to address the internal and external factors that led an individual into crime in the first place in order to deter them from future crimes. So it's a kind of positive deterrence. And then deterrence is more of a sanctions, the threat of sanctions or providing sanctions in order to deter. So they really work hand in hand. Rehabilitation and deterrence are both trying to accomplish the same end result. How do we measure deterrence in corrections? The key word there is recidivism. We define recidivism as the first incident of either an arrest or a return to DOC custody after being released from DOC custody, usually within a 1-year or 3-year period. I'm going to focus on recidivism as our primary measure of deterrence. I will just note in my testimony that another word that has been thrown around a lot is the word desistance. And some are pointing out that recidivism is a limited measure of correctional performance because it focuses simply on failure rather than success. And so they've coined this term desistance, which essentially is looking at success rather than failure, and also looking at rehabilitation as a process rather than, one day you're in crime and the next day you're out of crime, which is kind of what recidivism is about. Think about it as if our only measure in educational performance was school dropout rates. That would be a pretty limiting measure of performance in school and in education. That's similar with recidivism. But recidivism is still an important measure, and it's the best one that we have a lot of data on so far, so I'm going to focus on recidivism. As I mentioned, we authored a 2022 comprehensive recidivism report. The top-level finding from that report is that recidivism rates for the Department of Corrections have been high and pretty consistent for the last 2 decades, really. So the 3-year recidivism rate for the department in that report was 64.7%, meaning that approximately 2/3 of those who were released either returned or were rearrested within 3 years of being released. So high. We also estimated that 1 in every 10 police arrests in Pennsylvania were of someone who had previously served time within the Department of Corrections. More recently, recidivism rates have dropped a little bit since COVID. We're still trying to understand why that is, but still relatively small decreases in recidivism, and recidivism has mostly been pretty stable. The report identified several factors that are associated with recidivism, 7 factors in particular. So one was those diagnosed with a substance use disorder, Number 2, those with a mental health issue. Number 3, those who were assessed as being high risk for reoffending. Number 4, those with lower educational attainment. Number 5, those with a more extensive criminal history. Number 6, those who commit more infractions inside of prison. And number 7, those who receive less prison visits. We also found that older offenders and female offenders are less likely to recidivate, while property offenders are more likely to recidivate. So those are some of the key findings from our recidivism report. What do we know in terms of what is effective to deter or reduce recidivism in corrections? There are 7 principles that we can draw from the research literature about what is effective in terms of deterrence for corrections. The first principle is that a sanction must be delivered with a high degree of certainty in order to deter. In other words, the probability of receiving a sanction given an offense has to be highly probable. This goes back again to Professor Hare's testimony, and actually the idea goes back as far as criminology goes back. The 18th century legal jurist, scholar Cesar Beccaria stated that there are 3 elements of a punishment that deter. It has to be certain, severe, and swift. And what we've learned, again, as Professor Harris testified, is that the certainty and swiftness matter a whole lot more than the severity of the punishment. The severity doesn't seem to matter much at all. So number 1, a sanction has to be delivered with a high degree of certainty. Number 2, it has to be delivered swiftly. Immediate consequences are more effective than delayed consequences. Number 3, the severity doesn't matter as much as the certainty and swiftness. I've already mentioned that. In fact, sometimes there's a trade-off. So if we give more severe punishments, it actually comes at the expense of providing more certainty and swiftness because there's a lot of due process. And when we do more severe punishments, it actually comes at the expense of the things that really matter, which is the certainty and the swiftness, not the severity of the punishment. Number 4, a sanction must be a meaningful punishment to deter. So it doesn't have to be severe, but it has to pose some cost to the offender in their perception in order to deter. Number 5, a sanction must be fairly administered, and this point was also mentioned before. The perceived legitimacy and fairness of the sanction are important in impacting deterrence. If an individual does not perceive that the sanction is being implemented fairly, that the process is not fair, then that has less of a chance of deterring than if it's done fairly. Number 6, sanctioning resources should focus on the most high-risk offenders. This was also a point with the hotspots policing. It's the same in corrections. There's a small subset of high-risk offenders that we really need to focus our resources on to be most efficient. And then 7th point is that what we know is that informal deterrence mechanisms are more effective than formal deterrence mechanisms. What do I mean by informal deterrence mechanisms? These are things like a spouse, a partner, a family member, et cetera. These are community supports or social networks. So often what you'll hear in the literature is that, ironically, offenders are more scared of their mom than they are of the police. And so those things bear out in the research to matter more than sanctions like arrest or corrections. So the more that we can work with those informal social networks, then those things have a strong opportunity to deter criminal offending. Now I want to move into some specific practices and policies and programs that we've evaluated at the Department of Corrections that have shown to be effective. So I can give you an idea of just a few things that we've evaluated that are effective. I just want to point out that part of my job in evaluating programs is to establish a causal relationship from the program to recidivism. And what this means is that sometimes things that look like on the surface are having an impact are more correlational than causation. So that goes back to kind of a statistics 101 distinguishment. If you think about, for instance, ice cream sales and drownings both go up together. they're correlated, but we don't think that ice cream sales causes drownings, right? They both go up because there's more ice cream sales and more drownings in the summer when people are hot and they're swimming. So my role is to try to untangle specifically the causal impact of our programs, not just whether it's correlated with recidivism, but whether it's actually causing recidivism. So that's a footnote to the programs and practices that I'm going to mention briefly. A few of these programs that we found to be effective with causal research, so strong empirical research. One is we did a study on facilitating reentrant relocation after release. And so what happened here is we offered individuals an opportunity to be released to a different community than they were from originally after release, with some supports to go with that. And the research is kind of mixed, but what we found is that that seemed to help. So you think about, on the one hand, it's advantageous to go back home because you have those family supports. But on the other hand, you're also surrounded by some of the people that got you in trouble in the first place. And especially with drug offenders, what we found was that having a chance at a new beginning, having kind of a relocation, was an opportunity to start over and seem to reduce recidivism. A second program that we found to be effective is the State Drug Treatment Program. This was formerly called the State Intermediate Punishment Program. This is an alternative sentence for drug-involved offenders. They get time off of their sentence for participating in this. It's a very intense treatment program with 4 phases to the program. We found this to be a successful and rigorous research to reducing recidivism. We've also found our motivational boot camp program to be effective. I suspect that this is because we do a lot of rehabilitative things at the boot camp. Nationally, the research on correctional boot camps isn't great. Boot camps tend to not be as effective, but our boot camp has been quite effective in reducing recidivism according to our research. Another initiative that has been successful is providing financial education training for our inmate population. We partnered with the Department of Banking and Securities for a pilot program where they went around and provided basic financial management training in terms of how to manage a checking account, how to check your credit score, things like that. And that program found to be effective in actually reducing recidivism. The other program that we recently evaluated was our family visitation program, receiving visits while in prison from family members. And this did seem to not only be correlated with recidivism, but cause a slight recidivism reduction. The one caveat to that was we did look at whether in-person visits or video visits had a different effect. And we found that they had the same effect. Both of them reduced recidivism, but there wasn't a difference between in-person and video visits in that study in terms of recidivism reduction. Another initiative that has been effective is what has been referred to as the Swift, Certain, and Fair Supervision Program. One of the brand names for this is Project Hope, which started in Hawaii. And this builds on the very principles that we talked about in terms of deterrence. Essentially, how the program works is for probationers and parolees. You lay out the expectations clearly up front so that it's fair and there's no question about what the expectations of supervision are. And then you monitor closely and you respond immediately to every violation, but very mildly, maybe 24 hours or 48 hours in jail, not 6 months. Or, because what happens typically in supervision is that small things go undetected or they get ignored, they build up. Finally, the parole agent is so mad, he's throwing the book and they're sending the person away for 6 months, a year, or multiple years, rather than addressing it with mild sanctions immediately and consistently, very much like what a parent would do, right? This approach has been found to be effective and is picking up around the country. And then lastly, several of the testifiers have mentioned age. Aging isn't a program, but in a sense, it's one of the best programs we have because we know that after a certain age, late 20s, early 30s, the chance of recidivating goes down dramatically. And so incarcerating people and holding them for longer than that just doesn't have much deterrent effect. In conclusion, there are a few things that we're currently big initiatives that we're evaluating in the department that we're hopeful, but we don't have solid evidence on. We're doing studies on right now. And I'll just mention 4 of those. One is medication-assisted treatment. There's been a lot of interest around that for the treatment of substance use disorder. It's clear that MAT is effective in reducing overdose deaths and relapse, but not as clear whether it reduces recidivism, criminal recidivism. And so we're looking at that. We're doing a study on that right now. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a popular form of group therapy that's done in prison. We do that. It has been evaluated around the country. I would characterize a lot of the literature as fairly weak on that. So we're evaluating our own cognitive behavioral therapy initiative. We're also evaluating in-prison college courses. So you know the federal government has once again allowed Pell to fund college courses in prison. And we're doing the first really rigorous study of that in the nation to see what the impact of that is. Again, we're optimistic, but we don't have really solid research on that particular initiative at this point. And then lastly, some of you may have heard of Little Scandinavia, which is a prison unit at our SEI Chester prison, really quite innovative. It is modeled after a Scandinavian type of prison environment where it's more gentle and humane and rehabilitative, focusing on reintegration into the community. And so this has been an innovative unit that we are running and has gained a lot of interest. If you haven't been out to see it, I'd encourage you to come see it. But we're still very much in the middle of an evaluation of that. So we're evaluating that. We're going to see if that, in fact, reduces recidivism as is suspected. So there's a lot that we know. There's a lot that we still have to know. I think having an environment of innovation in corrections where we're trying new things is important. And also as important is whatever we do, let's test it out with data. Let's be scientifically informed. Let's be data-driven. Let's use the data to guide what we do so that we can stop doing things that are ineffective, that aren't deterring, and continue things that are effective. So that's our goal, and that's what we're trying to accomplish. I appreciate, again, the opportunity to testify this morning, and I look forward to answering any questions that you have.
Thank you. Any questions? Rep Rabb?
Thank all of you for your testimonies. I only have 17 questions. I mean, goodness gracious, there's a lot of content here. This is embarrassment of riches. Thank you all so much. Is there, what are the correlations between the type of punishments that happen in prison and recidivism? For instance, there's a lot of talk around solitary confinement or whatever euphemisms are used now. What does the data show in terms of how long or how frequently someone is put in the hole who is ultimately getting out, and to the extent to which that influences their behaviors on the outside? That's my first question.
Yeah. So the research there, it's a great question, really reiterates what we talked about with community deterrence, which is that the severity doesn't matter. So sending someone to the hole, especially for long periods of time, doesn't deter. It's really that swiftness and certainty. So we've tried to apply those same principles inside prison as that can be done outside prison with probation and parole and policing, and getting creative about more minor sanctions, but done immediately and swiftly. So maybe a loss of privileges, some short cell times, some things that can be alternatives to going to the restrictive housing unit for a long time, because as you're suggesting, that hasn't really shown to reduce recidivism or correlate with recidivism on the outside. And it's the same principle of the severity doesn't seem to matter as much.
And do you make recommendations to DOC in terms of desisting common practices that go against the research that you produce?
Do I make recommendations that go against the research?
Well, I mean, you basically said there's no benefit to putting someone in the hole for extensive periods of time, and yet for the past 7 years, visiting multiple prisons, I talked to a lot of people who've been inside or currently inside who talk about the extent to which they've been put in the hole for whatever reasons. And I'm not talking about the most severe reasons, if you stab someone. And so I'm wondering, what is the process by which your data gets reviewed by people who can influence the policy?
Yeah, so my job is to call balls and strikes, so I try to just be clear on what the research says and let my boss, the Secretary of Corrections, make the decisions. But I'll say when something doesn't work, when it's found to be ineffective. I joke that I have one of the most unenviable jobs in the department, along with our budget director, because she has to tell you that we don't have money for your program, and I have to say your program doesn't work. So. So I'll call the balls and strike. I'll say to our leadership when the research isn't supporting something. So I've done that before, and I'll continue to do that.
Thank you. And my last question is, what does the data show with regard to access to books and increasing literacy, whether it's formal education or otherwise? I'm familiar with a lot of things that are considered contraband that I would consider inherently positive that are not allowed. What does the research show in terms of the extent to which someone can read within their cell, participate in a program of any kind, versus the folks who don't have visits, don't or can't read, don't have access to a job, because not everyone has access to a job on the inside, I believe, or any other kind of program, and who may be exposed to harsh punishments. I imagine the combination of those four things is going to produce results we can all kind of anticipate. So if we know that there's a strong correlation between those things, virtual or in-person visits, access to programming, education, et cetera, what does the data show in terms of the extent to the population of folks who don't have access to those things that you believe are correlated or maybe even causal? And so we know what size population perhaps needs the most help on the inside.
Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of, at least causal research on the issue specifically of literacy. There is correlational research. I think increased literacy is clearly correlated with better outcomes. But it kind of goes back to that causal thing, and there's not really a lot of research on that. But it makes sense intuitively to me, and is something that we could definitely look at evaluating in the department. We haven't done a study on that yet, but it makes sense to me that increasing that kind of access to literature, literacy, things like that would have an impact on recidivism.
So just real quick, the population of folks who have low access to loved ones through virtual or in-person visits, who aren't part of a program or have a job, who do not have access to books, how big of a population is that? Because without any of those things, to your previous points, they're the ones who are most likely to recidivate when they get out, or perhaps make bad decisions while they're still in.
Right.
Do you have a sense of the demography or the size of that population? Because that seems to be the one that would be at most at risk.
Right. I don't have exact numbers. I would guess it's probably around a quarter, maybe, of the population. Keep in mind that some of that group that fall in that group have self-selected out of these things because of disciplinary infractions, or simply they don't want to participate in these kinds of things. They've communicated that they don't want to receive visits, or they don't want to participate in a program, so they've kind of self-selected out of that. But I would imagine it's probably about a quarter of our population that falls into that, not access to those things that you mentioned. Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Chair Rigby, do you have any questions?
Thank you. Again, thank you for your testimonies. I'm just curious, in our county, recidivism is very high, yet through our veterans courts, we see those numbers are very low. What are we doing different with veterans that we're not doing with our other inmates that is creating such a variance, a big variance between the two? Or is it the background they come from, or a discipline? I'm just trying to figure out what one is doing so well that the other one is failing at, if you can answer that.
Yeah, not being familiar with that program, I can't say specifically, but I would imagine it's what you suggested, which is the veteran population might be a different kind of population in their propensity towards offending, and so they have lower recidivism rates to begin with. We're doing veteran unit programs in the Department of Corrections, and actually that's really high on our priority to evaluate too. I didn't mention that one, but we haven't evaluated that program yet, and there's a lot of interest around evaluating that to really try to get at that, again, causal impact. And is it just a matter of the individuals going into the program, the veterans, or is it a matter of the programming itself, something about that being effective more so in terms of reducing recidivism? So I don't have a great answer at this point, but I suspect it's probably a combination of two. The programming is more effective, and it's also the types of individuals that are in that program.
And I can jump in as long as it's not a question about statistics. I'll leave those to you. So our mental health court, our drug court, our felony diversion program, those have teams. So you're not just like with a single probation officer who has a caseload of about 100 people or 200 people or whatever. If you're in our mental health court, drug court, veterans court, when you have like monthly meetings just with the drug court, mental health court, veterans court team. So there's more supervision, there's more resources available, and you're just, typically if you're on probation, you just report to your probation officer. You might not even talk every month. You might have to just report by phone every month, and you're not having access to those resources, and you don't have that team with you because, when you go to a drug court program, there's other individuals who are there who are also working with the team, and so the team has meetings, updates, how are things going, and they stay on top of things rather than just kind of having someone that you check in with. So there's more of a program there, and there's more resources for those programs, and that's what I would believe has led to the better result for recidivism rate, because otherwise, like I said, you're just going to have a probation officer that, unless you're getting arrested, you're really not going to have too much interaction with. So that's what would lead me to believe is the difference there.
And you mentioned mental health, and we have our crisis intervention teams, our trainings that we have for officers. We have a lot of corrections officers in it with 911 dispatchers have taken these classes, and we're finding out more and more that a lot of these incidents don't require arrest as much as they require treatment. And so I think you touched on that earlier, and I thank you for that. And as we learn more, those in the law enforcement side are dealing with and getting the proper training to handle those with mental health and drug issues, we're able to treat it rather than just incarcerate it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. For a quick clarification, Dr. Buckland, so I read the recidivism report, and it actually specifically states that it was fewer in-person visits that led to or was correlated with a higher recidivism rate, but in your testimony you said that it didn't matter if it was in-person or virtual, and I'm wondering if you can clarify that.
Sure. So the in-person versus virtual was a follow-up analysis to that report. It wasn't in that report. The thing in that report was, and again, it goes back, not to keep repeating, but it goes back to that whole correlation versus causation. And so this is, most of the national research on visitation has been correlational. And so it begs the question, is it just that more pro-social, more people who have more connections to begin with are the ones that are getting visits? And so they already are, to begin with, less likely to offend because they're the types of people that are connected and they're getting visits. It's not necessarily the visits itself. And so the recidivism report that we did was just strictly correlational. And it does show that, there is a high correlation, but then the next step we took was to really see if it was causal. And that was the follow-up study that we did to the recidivism report, where we tried to see if it was causal, and it is causal, but also if it's a causal difference between the in-person versus virtual.
Thank you. Last question. We talk a lot about tools in the toolbox for prosecutors in particular. when it comes to addressing crime. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or suggestions about what tools the legislature could provide in order to support kind of deterrence options.
So I know the professor had spoke about victims of crime and making sure that they are apprised of the situation, have their input, be measured and all that. So I know our victim witness grants, I believe it's the RAZA grant and the VOJO grant, those have went down. So for example, in my county, we have 4 separate magistrates. I have 1 victim witness coordinator, and now they've reduced the funding for our victim witness coordinator, that pays our entire salary for our victim witness coordinator is through that grant. So typically what you would want to have in a best case scenario is having someone there at all those magistrate hearings so that you can start having that relationship with the victims of a crime so they can keep in contact with them. One person for 90,000 people who live in Northumberland County is just not enough. And our victim witness coordinator does a great job. I mean, she's working more than we're paying her, doing a fantastic job, but she's one person who's covering 90,000 people. And that doesn't even include the people who are victims of a crime that don't live in the county. And so a lot of that burden has been passed on the attorneys. We also don't have a lot of support staff as well. But providing more funds and grants for victim witness services, I believe that would be a tremendous step that you guys could do, especially regarding, when I go back to mental health, having our law enforcement have access to a mental health expert on the front lines, is then that frees them up to do what they need to do. And then something like that de-escalation, that can take hours or days, maybe they have that ongoing relationship, and our local guys just don't have that time to do it. So if they had access to mental health expert or professional that could be there, who knows all the local mental hospitals, doctor, who knows those resources, that lifts a tremendous burden off our local law enforcement. That has them deal with the violent crimes and the crimes that they need to really focus their attention on, the investigations, and like I said, leads to a better result for the individuals suffering from the mental health crisis. These are better results for our community, and those 2 specific resources, I mean, would make the world of difference in my county, I can tell you that. And I know where we do have it in Milton, what that was done through a grant, it's been a tremendous success. And if we could have that in all the local departments that we had, I mean, it would be a big deal for the day-to-day operations and taking the burden off these individuals who, they have some training in mental health, but they're not mental health experts, and they can, essentially allows them to go off and do what they need to do while having this individual with an established relationship continue working with them. And, when they do go to jail, we can get the call to the mental health professional and have them set up for services and kind of have everything go together. Because what it was last year at our prison is we would get you stabilized, get you on your medication, but when you left the jail, they didn't give you medication to leave. So if you're not getting that medication, you're not getting a prescription for at least the next 2 months, 1 month out there, you're not getting a medical appointment in a month's time. And those are the individuals that really need the help to do it, because it's hard for them to do it on their own in general. And if you put these roadblocks up that they can't do it, they're not getting it done, and then they just decompromise, and now you're dealing with them again. So if we can have those services there, like I said, the mental health services, the victim witness services, we can get the funding for that, I mean, that would make a night and day difference for my county.
Thank you. Chair Rigby, any closing remarks? Thank you all. Thank you for your testimony, and this has been really informative, so I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
And with that, this hearing is adjourned.